Every day, mail travels thousands of miles across the United States. If you look up at the sky, you may see planes zooming through the air. Many of these planes are carrying your mail and delivering it in a matter of days. But did you know that the United States almost stopped its airmail service? In 1921, just a few years after the service began, the government wanted to take the mail planes out of the sky. It is thanks to a group of courageous pilots that the service continued. They set out to prove that planes could carry our mail day and night. These 7 pilots made a daring journey across the nation. One of these pilots would become more famous than the rest. His name was Jack Knight. At 27 years old, Jack Knight would fly through the darkness, snow, and fog. His bravery would give the airmail service the last breath it needed to survive. This is the story of Jack Knight's daring flight.
Hi, young historians. It's time for another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. We're so excited for the story in today's episode. It's a story of true adventure and of human ingenuity. It's also a story of perseverance and hard work. As with many stories on this podcast, you'll learn about someone not talked about much in history books, but his actions changed history forever. As you listen to this episode, imagine yourself flying through the winter just like Jack Knight. And think about what you would do if you were in his shoes. Would you have the courage to fly through the snow in the middle of the night? If you're like most people, the answer would be a resounding no way. So, it's a great thing that Jack Knight wasn't one of those people. Nowadays, we can have something delivered in 1 or 2 days. And we have people like Jack Knight to thank for being courageous enough to keep the Postal Service's dreams of flying alive. So, let's get back to the story.
Our story begins in 1921. The United States Airmail Service was in trouble. In just 3 years, 17 pilots had died carrying the mail. Flying was very dangerous, not to mention very expensive. Flight after flight kept getting delayed, which made the mail late. In 1921, people began wondering, did the United States really need an airmail service? Mail, after all, could be transported by train. That year, the incoming U.S. President Warren Harding wanted to make cuts to the government budget. The airmail service was one of the first places he looked. But not everyone wanted to see the service end. Otto Prager got word of Congress's plan to cut funding to the airmail service. He paced in his office trying to figure out what to do. Prager worked for the United States Postal Service. In fact, he was in charge of the airmail service. If the service ended, all his work and the sacrifices the pilots had made would have been for nothing. That's when Prager had an idea. What if he proved planes could transport the mail much faster than trains? He began scribbling down numbers on a piece of paper. He calculated that planes could carry the mail across the country in 36 hours. This was twice as fast as trains. To do this, the pilots would have to fly all day and night. There was just one problem. In 1921, airplanes did not fly at night. If you've ever been on a plane today, you might have noticed that there are lights inside and outside the plane. There are also hundreds of lights on runways to guide pilots. This was not the case in 1921. At that time, airplanes were not equipped to fly at night or in bad weather. None of the dials and instruments in the cockpit had lights. Airfields were not lighted properly. To make matters worse, the plane's compasses were often wrong. At night, pilots would get lost flying in complete darkness. Prager's idea was going to be very dangerous. His plan was this. a group of pilots would take turns carrying the mail across the country. The first pilot would start early in the morning in San Francisco, California. He would land in Nevada and pass it on to the next pilot. Then, that pilot would carry the mail to Utah and pass it to the next pilot. They would keep passing the mail on until, finally, it arrived in New York. With the plan in place, Prager just needed to pick a date. He looked at the calendar, and the date, February 22nd, caught his eye. That was the birthday of George Washington, the United States' first president. He thought this would be the perfect day for this historic flight. Yet Prager didn't always think about his pilots first. February 22nd was Washington's birthday, but it was also the middle of winter. This meant shorter days and bad weather. Prager had picked the worst time of the year to fly. But there was a group of brave pilots who believed in the mission. Many of them had been Army pilots during World War I. They did not want to see the Airmail service end, and they decided it was worth risking their lives. On February 22nd, 1921, the first two pilots took off in California. They began flying east towards Nevada to finish the first leg of the trip. To everyone's relief, they landed safely. Next, the pilot William Lewis began his part of the journey. He had just begun his flight to Salt Lake City when something went terribly wrong. Lewis's engine stalled 500 feet in the air. His plane dived into the ground and crashed. Lewis died instantly. The crew on the ground was in shock. Somehow, they were able to get the mail onto the next plane. They had to keep going. Meanwhile, the pilot Jack Knight waited in North Platte, Nebraska. He would be flying the mail from North Platte to Omaha. Knight had a small bandage across his nose. He had broken it in a crash just a week before. His nose ached and he was already tired from an earlier flight. Knight looked up at the sky. He was also worried about the weather. It did not look good. By now, it had started to grow dark outside. Around 7:40 p.m., a plane finally landed in North Platte. It was carrying the mail. Now, it was Knight's turn. But first, Knight had to wait for the ground crew to finish fixing up his plane. It had a damaged tail skid. This part of the plane sat under the tail and protected it from damage during takeoff and landing. At 10:44 p.m., the crew gave Knight the thumbs up. His plane's tail skid was fixed. It was a freezing February night, and it would be even colder up in the air. Knight stuffed newspapers in his clothes to keep the cold out and jumped into the cockpit. He turned on the ignition and took off into the sky.
Hi, young historians. Time for a quick break from this amazing story to tell you a bit more about Honest History. If you're enjoying this episode, then you'll love Honest History's magazines and books. Each one is filled with important adventures through the past, like the story of Cheng Yi Sao, a Chinese woman who commanded one of the largest pirate fleets in history, to Mansa Musa from Africa, one of the wealthiest people to ever live. You can pick up a copy or subscribe and receive 3 issues delivered straight to your doorstep every 3 months. Just go to honesthistory.co and use code ANYTIMENOW for a 10% discount. That's honesthistory.co and special promo code ANYTIMENOW. Okay, let's get back to the story.
As Knight flew over Lexington, Nebraska, he saw a bonfire. The citizens had come together on that freezing night and set a fire to help light the way. As he zoomed past overhead, the crowd below cheered. With each minute, the weather grew worse and worse. Knight had to fly lower and lower to stay under the clouds. He looked out his window. Oh dear, it was snowing, and the snow was getting heavier. Finally, below him, he could see the dim light of gasoline drums. They were lining the runway to the airfield. He was almost there. He began descending and safely landed on the runway.
Where's the other pilot?
Knight asked as soon as he landed. The station manager, Bill Votaw, was holding a cup of coffee for the tired pilot. He gave Knight the bad news. There was no other pilot. The flight had been canceled due to bad weather. Knight knew he had to make a decision.
I'm going to take the flight on.
The ground crew began preparing Knight's plane for the next flight. He pulled out a map and began to study it. He has never flown this route before. When the snow finally began to slow down, Knight jumped back into his plane. He turned the ignition and heard the roar of the engine. Votaw watched as Knight's plane climbed up into the air. He prayed the pilot would land safely in Chicago. By this time, Knight was completely exhausted. He could feel the rumble of the engine through his whole body. It was making him even sleepier. But he needed to stay awake. He peered below and saw the landing field in Des Moines. It was covered in snow. There was no way he was going to land there. Knight adjusted his route and started flying towards the next closest airfield in Iowa City. In the distance, Knight spotted a light. It was a flare. Was that the Iowa City airfield? He crossed his fingers and began to descend. The plane landed, its wheels turning over the icy ground. Knight breathed a sigh of relief. It had been a difficult flight, and Knight was eager to hand over the mail. He saw a man running towards him. After he opened his cockpit, Knight turned to the man.
Where is the other pilot?
He asked.
There are no other pilots,
the man said. The weather was too dangerous, and nobody wanted to fly in it. As it turned out, the man was only the watchman. Knight quickly realized that no one else was at the airfield to help. Knight sat there for a moment. Again, it seemed it was all up to him. He turned to the watchman and asked for gasoline. Knight was going to fly the rest of the way to Chicago. The watchman looked at Knight like he was insane.
In this snow?
He asked in shock. Knight nodded. Maybe it was a little crazy, but he had come so far and already risked so much. Knight wasn't going to give up now. After Knight's plane was filled with gasoline, the plane climbed back up into the sky. Knight thought, or rather hoped, this flight would be a lot smoother than the last one. The snow had slowed down and the clouds had begun to clear. But there was something else he didn't anticipate. Fog. Suddenly, Jack Knight couldn't see the ground below. Thankfully, as the sun began to rise, the fog quickly cleared. Knight looked beneath him and recognized the blue water of Lake Michigan. And then he saw the buildings and the city smog. He had made it to Chicago. The engine began to sputter and spit. Thank goodness he was almost there. As he approached the airfield, he was surprised by the scene below him. There was a crowd of people dressed in their finest suits and dresses. They had been waiting for him. At 8:40 in the morning, his wheels touched the ground. He began asking about the next pilot. To his relief, Jack Webster was there, ready to take the mail to Cleveland, Ohio. 20 minutes later, Knight watched Webster's plane soar up into the sky. Like everyone else in Chicago, Knight waited for news. Later that day, Knight got word. At 4:50 p.m. on February 23, 1921, the last pilot touched down in Long Island, New York. In a matter of 33 hours and 21 minutes, the 7 pilots had carried 8 bags of mail across the country. They flew day and night through frigid temperatures, snow, and fog. They had done the impossible. Knight decided to take the next 24 hours to rest before stepping foot on another plane. Over the coming days, newspapers announced the incredible news.
New record in air for delivery of mail. Aerial mail crosses U.S. in 33 hours.
The headlines read. Journalists were quick to point out the man who made it all possible. The New York Tribune wrote,
Jack Knight was the hero of the remarkable record.
Jack Knight brushed off the praise.
Any one of the Airmail pilots would have done the same,
He said,
because we were all keenly interested in seeing that aviation and air transportation had been given a chance to develop.
After the flight, Congress began rethinking their budget cuts. The planes had delivered the mail in record time, much faster than trains.
Maybe the Airmail service was worth saving after all?
They thought. The government set aside $1.25 million to expand the service. The Airmail service would continue. It took Otto Prager's dangerous idea and a group of brave pilots to keep the planes in the air. For the next few years, Knight would be the most famous pilot in the United States. People across the country kept talking about Jack Knight's night flight. After making history, Knight would work with the Postal Service on a special project. Can you guess what it was? A system of beacons to light the way. It was about time the pilots didn't have to fly in the dark.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed hearing about Jack Knight's flight as much as I did. I admire Jack's perseverance for so many reasons. One of which is that I absolutely hate being cold, and I couldn't imagine trying to fly a plane in the middle of the night while nearly freezing to death. And reason number 2 is that I think it would have been really easy for Jack to get angry at the pilots who didn't show up and to want to quit right then and there. Even when he was cold and exhausted and likely very stressed, Jack Knight continued to fight for what he believed in and made it possible for the Airmail service to thrive. Maybe the next time you feel disappointed in others or are tired and want to give up on your dreams, you can remember Jack Knight and his epic flight through the night to show the world the difference one person can make. We can all make a difference in this world if we set our minds to it. That's all for now. But if you want to learn more about the history of Airmail, be sure to check out issue 12 of Honest History magazine titled Special Delivery. You can learn all about the U.S. Postal Service and learn cool facts like how parents could send their children across the country via mail. See you all next time. This episode was hosted by Kyle Kinane and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Randall Lawrence. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.